Joe Simonson is the senior investigative reporter for the Washington Free Beacon. He's been digging into this very question and has an excellent report on it today. Joe, good afternoon to you.
Vince, how are we?
I'm doing okay, but I'm very concerned about my government again. You say that they have decided to swap science for indigenous knowledge. Tell us how this has happened.
Sure. So I'm sure your listeners will remember Biden campaigned on and ultimately won on the message of following the science. And we see that on blue lawns or in Democratic suburbs across the country. We see little signs that say, in this house, we trust the science and all that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things Biden did shortly when he came into office was say, I'm going to make the Office of Science and Technology Policy a cabinet-level agency, like the State Department. The problem is, less than a year after that agency got that promotion to the cabinet, they put out a memorandum. And this memorandum did not really make much of a splash. They didn't go on TV and primetime and say, oh, we're making some changes.
Right.
But the memorandum still went out. And in that memorandum, it said indigenous knowledge or native science must be considered when making policy or regulations in more than 24 agencies. What is indigenous science or indigenous knowledge? Well, there's no real definition of it, but essentially it's folk wisdom passed down by Native Americans, which means if some tribal elder says, oh, you think there's an endangered bird in this area. Well, actually, and we hunt that bird. But actually, we have a different way of measuring a population of a certain species, and that's passed down through generations. So we actually think there's a lot more of that bird in this area.
So we govern with a vibe rather than data.
It's totally vibe based, and even more than that, in the same paragraph that the White House is talking about a commitment to science, the next sentence will say, therefore, we have to incorporate spiritual knowledge from Native people.
Okay. All right. So in your piece today, you include a number of links to government webinars. And I wouldn't be surprised, by the way, if the Biden administration takes these down now because you called attention to them. But luckily, we were able to capture some of the audio from them. And these are webinars. These are Zoom calls where you have government officials sitting around with various Native tribal leaders talking about the replacement of what they call Western traditional science with indigenous knowledge. And for instance, here's an example of someone called Damaris Tevuk, who's the lead researcher for the Native Neighborhood Community Study, saying that traditional knowledge is going to be different for every single family. Listen to this.
I think the reason why traditional knowledge is listed as abstract here is because traditional knowledge is very contextual, and I will repeat that traditional knowledge, it's going to vary even among different families within the same tribe in the same area. They're going to have different information.
Wait, so how can we rely on it if it's going to be different among families who live in the same exact area?
Well, that's actually the $1 million question, Vince. That's actually the $500 million question, because one of the things, the consequences of this memorandum that the White House issued 2 years ago, is that indigenous knowledge and native science has to be used in what are called highly influential scientific reports. Now, that's a lot of government jargon for something that essentially means if the Department of Commerce puts out a report or a study that says this certain type of fishing or whatever, forestry method, it really should be outlawed. It's bad for the environment or whatever. If it has more than $500 million of economic consequences, the government gets to use native science to reach those conclusions. So in other words, if a native tribesman says, oh, yeah, my ancestors told me that this tree that actually has no real meaning, significance in normal science cannot be cut down, and it screws up the logging industry, that has the same weight as like a lab study that the EPA traditionally does.
Okay, so this is all like insane. Obviously, there's another piece here I want to share. A woman called Winona Wilson. She's an EPA official. She says in this webinar that Indigenous people have secret knowledge that they may or may not be willing to share. And remember, when it comes to the government, if they make a decision, all of the decision making is subject to FOIA. Like you're actually able as an American citizen to find out what went into this decision. You can normally get the paperwork, but it's not true with Indigenous knowledge. Take a listen to this.
We want to be able to work with Indigenous knowledge appropriately when Indigenous nations and people make the decision to share it. We understand that integrating Indigenous knowledge and worldview into federal decision-making will result in better decision-making. At the same time, we understand Indigenous nations and peoples will decide what is appropriate to share with the federal
and what is not. Here, Joe Simonson, what if there's some Indigenous knowledge that could save us from the looming climate catastrophe that they're refusing to share with us? What do we do?
Well, that's a great question. The actual more disturbing implication of that soundbite you just played is actually the opposite, right? So if the EPA puts out some study that has all these regulatory consequences, or it doesn't have the EPA, I mean, there are more than 24 government agencies now are affected by this. If they make some decision that says, we spoke to various tribes and elders and whatever, and we decided this is the best course of action, what the tribes and what the Biden administration says they'll work with the tribes or individual Native Americans on is saying, we won't let the public know what that knowledge was.
Right. Like in other words, like the public won't be made aware of what the rationale was for this dramatic decision that upends an entire economy.
Correct. That's exactly what the tribes are saying. That's exactly what the Biden administration is not along the way with.
Oh, man. By the way, your phone's breaking up a little bit here. I don't know what might be inducing that. There are clearly forces who would like to stop you from reporting this.
Sorry about that.
Let me play some more audio though while your reception hopefully recovers. This is Gretchen Goldman. She's an assistant director for environmental science, engineering policy, and justice at the White House Office of Science and Technology. The longer the title, the more ridiculous the person. Here's Gretchen Goldman starting her remarks at this webinar with a, quote, land acknowledgement. This is a lefty ritual.
I'm excited to join you all today. My name is Gretchen Goldman. I'm the Assistant Director for Environmental Science, Engineering, Policy, and Justice at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. So first, I wanted to acknowledge that I'm giving this presentation from Washington, D.C., which is the ancestral homelands of the Anacostan and Piscataway peoples, who are the original stewards of this land and who continue to live in this region.
Gretchen Goldman goes on to say this White House, that is the Joe Biden White House, has decided that we will supplant Western science with indigenous traditional ecological knowledge.
So the Biden-Harris administration hosted its first White House Tribal Nations Summit last November. And among several announcements and discussion topics that were included in that event, President Biden announced the White House initiative to elevate the role of indigenous traditional ecological knowledge in federal decision-making.
Yeah, so that's how we got here, Joe.
Yeah, sorry about that, Vince. Can you hear me better now?
I hear you great now. Go for it.
Yeah, the spirits are unhappy with me, I guess. But you joke, and we joke about the spirits, but I really can't emphasize this enough, is that the position of the federal government, the position of the United States government, is that Native Indians, Native Americans, indigenous people, whatever, basically we get to use their religious beliefs when crafting policy going forward.
Yeah.
And that affects FEMA, that affects the State Department, that affects all sorts of agencies. And the cherry on top, again, just to reiterate, is you don't get to know what that knowledge is.
There was, the fire that just burned in Lahaina, western Maui, burned down an entire town, left a lot of people dead, a lot of people missing. I noticed, it's in your coverage today as well, Joe Simonson, but I noticed during this saga that one of the things that was raised is that it may water, the precious resource of water that's, you typically want to use it for a fire, may have been prevented from getting to Lahaina by a man who believed that water had spiritual principles, that we needed to conserve it, that maybe we shouldn't rush it over to Lahaina. Are there real world consequences to this type of idiocy?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. The case is still out on what happened in Hawaii. Certainly there's been a lot of reporting that suggests there were, well, let's just say non-scientific decisions made that could have potentially averted disaster there. But where this has really caught on and where it's really from is our neighbors up north in Canada. Now, in Canada, they have a much more so using Indigenous knowledge here is very new. Up in Canada, it's been going on for almost 2 decades now, if not a little bit longer. And the problem is that in Canada, it actually works counterintuitive. It actually hurts environmental regulation. I'm not talking about like climate change stuff, but I'm saying if like polar bear hunting is an issue in Canada. Everyone loves polar bears. They're very beautiful animals. The problem is that the native tribes very up north in the middle of nowhere in Canada also hunt polar bears. They sell their pelts on exotic exchanges, and they go for a lot of money, but they're killing all the polar bears, so it's a problem. And so for a long time, the Canadian government would work with these tribes and say, hey guys, like you're killing polar bears. And what the tribes would say, and this goes to something I said earlier, is say, no. This Western way of measuring bear population is totally off. You don't understand. We see bears all the time.
Right.
And for about 20 years, they did not regulate the polar bear trade.
Right. So in other words, this has very real world consequences. Although, yeah, as you're saying all this, I did think, though, speaking of Western medicine, I mean, Anthony Fauci was basically in charge of our entire COVID response. I think I would have rather have had a tribal medicine man in charge than Anthony Fauci. So there are some trade-offs here, Joe Simonson.
Vince, I actually tried reaching out to Fauci for this story. I would have loved his perspective, but I never heard back.
He doesn't even want to defend Western medicine. How about that? Oh, Joe Simonson, senior investigative reporter for the Washington Free Beacon. Thank you for digging into this. I'm sorry it's happening. I'm glad I know about it. Thank you, Joe.